Um, Welcome and good day, and thank you for attending. My name is Ed Garza, and I am your facilitator today. I am a Vietnam veteran from Orange County, California, and I'm also a member of the Orange County Peace Coalition, Military Families Speak Out, and Veterans for Peace. I'm happy to have as co-host our friend and Military Families Speak Out member, Mary Ladke.
Hi, I'm Mary Ladke, and I have been an active member of Military Families Speak Out for over 15 years. I'm also on the coordinating committee for United for Peace and Justice, which is a national network of peace and justice groups, of which MFSO is a member. Now I'm going to introduce Jules Vacara. She is our staff person. She is a staff person for Veterans for Peace National. Jules will be our Zoom manager and will fill us in how this is going to work today. Jules?
All right, folks. Hi, I'm Jules. Thank you for introducing me, Mary. That was lovely. So we are going to have chat during this Zoom meeting. I know not everybody is a fan of chat. So in case you're not, you don't have to turn the chat feature on. If you just make your Zoom full screen, you will not see the chat boxes on the side. And if you don't want to see the little previews that come up of chat, if you look along the bottom of your screen, there are several words. There's the mute and the video button that are very common for us all to use. If you see the chat button, there is instead of clicking on the chat, there's a little up arrow, a caret that you can click on that says show chat previews. So if you don't want to see chat at all and don't want to be distracted by it, make your Zoom full screen and turn off the checkbox by show chat previews. However, we are hoping to have an active chat today. So if you have a question for one of our panelists or for both of our panelists, we would like for you to drop that question into chat. And the way that you're going to do that, because if we do have an active chat, they would be harder to find if it starts scrolling. I want you to type the word question in all caps before your question. I'm going to type a question into the chat right now to show an example. Everybody see that? If you want to be in the chat and asking questions, can I get a thumbs up? Does people see that?
Yep.
All right, awesome. I have one more thing. During this meeting, we are not going to have verbal questions from our audience, which means that most of you will remain muted throughout this entire meeting. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give y'all a chance to get all of it out. And then I'm going to mute everyone because it's the easiest just to click mute all, which means that our host and our panelists will then have to unmute themselves. You guys got that?
Okay.
All right, if you would like to welcome everybody today, now is the time. Come off mute. Welcome,
everybody.
Love you guys.
Wonderful panel to have organized. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Now it's time for me to mute everyone. And don't forget, our hosts and panelists will have to come off of mute. And that's it for me. Here we go. Oh, I forgot something. Sorry. For our panelists, you will get a time at 4 minutes, and Ed will let you know at the 5-minute mark for each question. Sorry, that was the one thing I forgot. Go ahead, Ed.
Okay. Thank you, Jules and Mary. Before we get started, let's have a moment of silence to remember all those that have suffered losses as a result of this horrific war in Ukraine. We are here today to find answers to your questions to what is the best path to lasting peace in Ukraine. We are aware that there are many different opinions and solutions on how to achieve peace. The organizers for this event thought that there must be a way to discuss these different perspectives on whether or not the peace movement can actually play a part in achieving this lasting peace. How can we, as instruments for peace, unite and work together to make this happen? We will post links to resources on the chat. If you have resource links to post, you can also post them on the chat. It's now my honor to introduce our two esteemed guests, Medea Benjamin and Bill Fletcher. I will give you a brief introduction of their activities. Medea Benjamin is the co-founder of the women-led peace group Code Pink. She is also co-founder of the human rights group Global Exchange, the Peace in Ukraine Coalition, Unfreeze Afghanistan, and the Alliance for Cuba Engagement and Respect. She was described by the Los Angeles Times as one of the high-profile leaders of the peace movement and was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. She is the author of the books Drone Warfare, Killing by Remote Control, Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the US-Saudi Connection, and Inside Iran, The Real History of Politics of the Islamic Republic of Iran and War in Ukraine, Making Sense of Senseless Conflict. Her articles appear regularly in outlets such as The Hill, Salon, Common Dreams, and The Progressive. Bill Fletcher Jr., a lifelong activist, entered the labor movement as a welder in a shipyard. He has worked for several labor unions in addition to serving as a senior staff person in the AFL-CIO. Fletcher is the former president of Trans-Africa Forum, a senior scholar with the Institute for Policy Studies and co-author of The Indispensable Ally, Black Workers and the Formation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, 1934-1941. The co-author of Solidarity Divided, The Crisis in Organized Labor and a New Path Towards Social Justice, and the author of They're Bankrupting Us and 20 Other Myths About Unions. Fletcher is a syndicated columnist and a regular media commentator on television, radio, and the news. Okay. The questions we will ask our guests were submitted by the audience and planning committee. If you have any questions, please post them on the chat and we will do our best to get to them. Both guests will be asked the same question and we will have 5 minutes to answer. Jules will sound a chime when there is 1 minute left. Let's begin. First question to Bill. Do you think the US and other nations are intensifying the war by continuing to provide weapons to Ukraine and Russia?
I think that the war is continued because the Russians won't withdraw. I think that's the fundamental issue here. And you know, the question of the Ukrainians getting weapons, well, if they don't have weapons.
I'm so sorry, Bill. I was trying to mute somebody who came in. My apologies.
Okay. If the Ukrainians don't get weapons, then they'll be forced to surrender and they'll be the piece of the graveyard. So I think that people have to be very clear about that. Since there's, with the exception of a few individuals that seem to be hallucinating, most people agree that Russia invaded Ukraine and that it was illegal. And so the question then really comes down to, how do you respond to an illegal invasion?
Go ahead, Ed.
You're muted, Ed.
Okay, thank you. The same question to Medea. do you think the US and other nations are intensifying the war by continuing to provide weapons to Ukraine and Russia?
Well, it's interesting that that question includes other nations providing weapons to Russia, because let's recognize as this war drags on, more countries are getting involved. For example, North Korea and Iran sending weapons to Russia, and the possibility, hope it doesn't happen, of the Chinese getting involved on the side of Russia. In the meantime, there's about 40 nations that are sending weapons or engaged in the support for Ukraine. And let's not be under the illusion that the US and the West just happened to start sending weapons into Ukraine after the Russian invasion. This has been going on since the 2014 uprising, when there was supposed to be a Minsk agreement, but now we see from interviews that the head of Germany and of France said that it was really an opportunity to build up Ukrainian forces. So instead of using the agreement to build peace in the region, the West used the agreement to start sending in weapons, training Ukrainian military. And here we have the war today that's been going on for 9 years now. So the weapons have been a disincentive for peace, and the involvement of the West in creating the context for this war is also something that we should condemn. So I would say, yes, at this point, there are so many nations involved in sending more weapons, fueling this war, and that it is extremely dangerous. And the best thing to do would be to stop the flow of weapons and to call for a ceasefire and peace talks.
Thank you. Medea, we have the next question for you. Gary from California asks, is it a misuse of our military to train and advise the Ukrainian military on the use of weapons?
Well, as I just said, this has been going on now since 2014. It would have been nice if the US had pressured all the parties involved in the Minsk agreement to actually implement that agreement, which would have included a change in the constitution in Ukraine so that the Donbas region would be autonomous. And when it's autonomous, let's remember that was autonomous within the nation state of Ukraine. If that had been implemented, which it was not, then we wouldn't be in this situation today. But having sent in weapons as of 2014, when it was Obama who was the president, and there was a stipulation that they just be defensive weapons, as soon as Trump came in, that stipulation was lifted and they started sending in offensive weapons as well. So I think, yes, the US role in this has been to try to give the idea that Ukraine should respond to the conflict in the Donbas and Crimea through military means instead of through negotiations.
Thank you. Bill, the same question for you.
See, I think that we have to begin with the issue of the national question. That is, do countries have the right to national sovereignty or not? And do big countries have the right to intervene in the internal affairs of smaller countries? So if the United States had no right to invade Iraq, if it had no right to threaten Cuba, Venezuela, Panama, etc., how we can suggest that the Russians had any business interfering in the internal affairs of Ukraine is beyond me. And so the bottom line is, I mean, and with all due respect to what Medea was raising, the Donbas is an area within the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine, recognized including by Russia, beginning in 1991. Recognized again in 1994 with the Budapest Accords. Putin has done an amazing job of moonwalking on those decisions and those agreements in order to engage in aggression. So the question is, what do we do? And do countries that are threatened with aggression have the right to resist? There's a lot of debate about the Minsk Accords, and including that there were open violations by the Russians, and the Russians had contempt for it. So the Minsk Accords at best was going to be a temporary thing, which goes to the question of, yes, there obviously needs to be a negotiated settlement that recognizes the borders and integrity of Ukraine, and where there are guarantees of the safety of Ukraine, and no intention on the part of Ukraine to interfere in the internal affairs of Russia. I mean, those seem to be the very basic propositions. But do they have a right? Do they have a right to call upon other countries to assist them? Of course they do.
Thank you, Bill. The next question is for you also. First, how do you see the war ending? What would a ceasefire mean? Would it be just an excuse for both sides to resupply and reload?
That's a very interesting question. I think in terms of the second part, it sort of depends. I think that there's a number of ways that this could end. One way is something along the lines of the Korean War, with an armistice where there's no treaty, but military forces hold their position. I'm not saying that this is a just resolution. I'm saying that I could imagine that would be one possibility. Another, of course, is that the Russian military falls apart and there's a major mutiny. And there's some sort of reorganization. And obviously a third is that the Ukrainians fall apart. But I think that the optimal answer is what I've been raising continuously, which is the need for international actors who can serve the role of mediators. But both parties have to be prepared to talk. Now, negotiations do not presuppose a ceasefire. In the Korean War, of course, negotiations were going on for 1 to 2 years before the armistice. In the Vietnam War, the negotiations were going on for several years before the end of the war. So the notion that there has to be a ceasefire before talks can happen is completely without historical foundation. But what is needed, it seems to me, is an honest broker or honest brokers to engage the parties, and probably in very quiet negotiations, something that's very far away from television cameras.
Thank you. Medea, that same question for you. You want me to read
Yes,
it?
I just want to go back to something Bill Fletcher said earlier about that large countries should not intervene in the internal affairs of other countries. And let's recognize how incredibly deep the US involvement was in the internal affairs of Ukraine for many years now. And we can get into that more later, but I think it's important to know that the US has been egging this on certainly since 2014, and the evidence of US involvement is very clear and will probably come out in more depth as time goes by and we learn more. But yes, big countries should not interfere in the internal affairs. Russia should not have invaded, and the US should not have tried to orchestrate the change of government in 2014. And then in terms of where and how peace can be achieved, let's look back at the agreement that was being hashed out with the mediation of Turkey back in March, just 1 month after the invasion, when there was a 15-point plan that included Russian troops would leave, that there would be neutrality for Ukraine with protection from strong countries. And when we think who those strong countries, it could be US, could be UK, could be Turkey, and self-determination for the people in the Donbass, putting off the issue of Crimea for years to come. I mean, this was all going along smoothly until the UK and the US went in to sabotage those negotiations. So we could go back to them. Certainly there is the Chinese peace plan now that is an outline of certain principles that should be taken into account. How would that move forward? I think what we're seeing is the pressure coming from the outside, pressure from the Chinese on the Russians, but the US needs to put pressure on Ukraine as well. And we as citizens have to put pressure on our own government that has been a tremendous impediment towards peace talks. We see that so clearly now when both Zelensky and Putin looked favorably upon the Chinese proposal, but the US immediately just ridiculed it, even saying that it would be against the UN Charter to go for a ceasefire because that would be validating the gains that Russia had made. So I think it goes back to us. How much pressure can we put on Biden so that he will not get in the way of peace talks?
Thank you very much. Jules, I was wondering, do you have any questions from the chat yet?
I sure do. Let's see here.
And that would be going to, this question would be going to Medea.
Okay. The question is from Rachel. Thank you, Rachel. What if NATO withdrew? Would that spur Russia to ceasefire/withdrawal?
Can you just clarify what if NATO withdrew from where?
Well, we have everybody on mute, so maybe not.
Well, yeah, I don't quite understand the question. So if NATO withdrew from the active participation in the war in Ukraine, that would have to happen as part of some kind of peace process because NATO wouldn't just withdraw. I'm looking in the chat to see if there's any clarification of that question.
Okay. Okay, I guess we can go on to Bill now. What would your answer to that question be?
Well, NATO is supporting Ukrainians. So if what this means is what would happen if NATO stopped aiding the Ukrainians would be defeated. Putin has not indicated that he has any particular interest in real peace without demolishing Ukraine. He was very clear about that in the year or so up to the invasion, with denying the legitimacy of the Ukrainians, which I actually want to offer as a point that I think in many of these discussions, we ignore Ukrainians. We act as if this is a fight that's going on between Zeus and Apollo or something. It's going on Mount Olympus between the gods, and that the people at the base of the mountain have nothing to do with what's going on. And so, for example, in what you were raising, Medea, about US involvement, well, the US is involved everywhere in the world. So using your argument, the people of the world, have no agency, that everything is basically manipulated by the United States. And so if you look at the 2014 uprising, which Medea keeps making reference to, what's very interesting about that is that it was a mass uprising. There was a great deal of Russian involvement in Ukraine, leading to that. Certainly the United States and Russia and others were probably involved in the internal affairs of Ukraine. The Russians made a very quick move to seize Crimea and to promote secessionist movements. I mean, so at that point, Ukraine was invaded. The war started in 2014. It did not start in February 2022. It started then. And so we've got to deal with the fact that the Ukrainians themselves are fighting to defend the territory that is internationally recognized. We don't have to agree with the Ukrainian government any more than we would have had to have agreed with the Polish government in September 1939 when the Nazis invaded. You didn't have to be a proponent of the Polish government or of any of the other governments that were being overthrown as a process of the Nazi invasion. The problem was that the invasion was wrong. Those invasions were wrong. In 2014, the Russian aggression was wrong. And in 2022, it continues to be wrong. And so the belief that this war will come to an end, this is where I would agree with Medea, that I cannot imagine the allies of Ukraine stopping assistance unless it's part of some sort of international agreement.
Thank you. Okay, and you get the next question first, Bill. When do you think Putin and Zelensky will come to the table to negotiate for peace?
I think that they're already negotiating. I don't mean that as individuals. I mean, you know, just studying history, I'm sure that they're negotiating. When they would come to the table publicly is when one or the other is ready to say ouch, and that something qualitative needs to change. Either internal problems in Russia or Ukraine force this, whether it's military stagnation will happen. It's really hard to tell. But to the extent that Putin, just looking at his track record, to the extent that Putin believes that if he holds out longer, that there's a good chance that the West will crack, I suspect he won't have an incentive in elevating the negotiations.
Okay, thank you. And Medea, that same question for you. When do you think Putin and Zelensky will come to the table to negotiate for peace?
Well, like Bill said, I know there are negotiations on certain issues that are already happening. We see that grain deal to get the grain out of Ukraine, also to make sure the fertilizers from Russia were not part of the sanctions. And that grain deal gets renewed every 6 months or every 3 months. So there's constant talk about that. There has been talks to get to stop the nuclear power plant, the Zaporizhia plant, from exploding and getting the International Atomic Energy Agency into that plant. And there have been many talks about prisoner swaps, successful ones that have been happening on a regular basis. So certainly there are talks. The question is, when will there be talks to end the war? And I go back to saying that I feel that it is the US and the UK that have been major players in stopping those talks. And while I still have time, Bill, I want to say, you know, you act like it's okay just to take it as a given that the US interferes in countries all over the world. But this is a very particular country along Russia's border that is full of people that are ethnic Russians living in the Donbass, living in Crimea, and where the US helped to orchestrate a changeover from a pro-Russian government to one that was anti-Russian. And that even before that, Assistant Secretary Nuland bragged that the US had spent $5 billion, this was back in 2013, to build up these kind of civic organizations that were anti-Russian. And we have to recognize there certainly is an aspect of a proxy war going on here. And I like to bring up a quote by the head of the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, where most of this $5 billion was coming through when he said, that Europe, that if we can promote Ukraine joining Europe, that will be a critical step towards regime change in Russia. So the US has been so involved in this, and the US is now a part of the problem by stopping these negotiations.
Okay, thank you. You have the next question from Dawn from Maine. Is China's 12-point peace plan currently the world's best hope?
Who is that question to?
That is to Medea, because you answered.
Yes. China's peace plan is not a detailed peace plan. It doesn't talk about what would happen in the Donbass, what would happen in Crimea. It lays out a set of principles. And what I think is positive is that when President Xi from China went to Russia and talked to Putin, there was positive response from Putin, and that Zelensky has also had positive response. When Macron was just in China, talking to the Chinese to try to get them to make sure that they didn't get closer to Russia on this, and as they say, to push Russia to the peace table, there were positive responses there as well. So I think that the Chinese can play a very important role. Now, again, I get to what is the US? The US does not want to see China be a mediator. And that's why they responded so quickly and so negatively to China's set of principles. And yet, I think I agree with Bill on this one, that China would be one of a group of nations that are starting to form together. We have President Lula from Brazil talking about a peace club of nations that could come together. We already had the head of Turkey, Erdogan, acting as a mediator. The Pope has been very positive in this, the Secretary General. So there are a lot of possibilities. I think the Chinese would be one of those actors and can play a very important role because they have a lot of leverage when it comes to Russia, given that they are buying so much of the Russian oil that previously went to Europe before the sanctions on that Russian energy.
Okay, thank you. Jules, do you have any more questions from the chat?
I sure do. I have a question from Jeff. How viable is the long-term survival of Ukraine as a nation state? Can they realistically be expected to survive as a nation state if the unjust war doesn't end in the foreseeable future?
Okay.
Dennis.
And this question goes to Bill.
I'm going to use my 4 minutes to do two things. One is to respond to something that Medea said, and then to respond to this. Let me respond to this first. Putin does not want Ukraine to survive. So if the intent of the question is, if the war continues and Russia wins, will Ukraine be destroyed? And I think that the answer is yes. I think that there might be a rump state, but it would basically be destroyed. It just so happens that the overwhelming majority of the Ukrainians aren't interested in their state being destroyed. So the thing I wanted to respond to in terms of what Medea was saying is, again, issue of agency on the part of the Ukrainians. We can see many places around the world where the US has its fingerprints. I'm not here to defend the US role. I'm here to defend the Ukrainians. And my position is that the Ukrainians have the right to resist foreign aggression. They have a right to obtain the necessary aid to stop an aggressor. In 1939, I would have said that the Poles, despite the reactionary nature of the Polish regime, had the right to defend itself against a Nazi invasion, and that it was right for other countries to have supported them, as opposed to the way that the Soviets betrayed them. Right? So I believe that this issue of national self-determination is critical, and that in 2014, there was an uprising against a very corrupt pro-Russian president. And was the United States involved? Certainly. Was Russia involved? Certainly. But the problem is, if we continue to articulate this as all about the battle between the gods, then we miss what's happening on the ground. We miss what the people are doing, what their movements are doing. And we're looking at everything as the result of the machinations of the great powers. And that's a particular kind of theory that exists. It's an establishment theory called realism, right? With which I just happen to disagree, and I would substitute internationalism of the oppressed.
Okay, thank you. So I think I missed one of the questions, but I'm going to start with the next question. And this would go to Bill. Is the demand that either side have an all-out victory realistic? Is it worth the human cost of war and the risk of escalating the war? Bill.
I thank you. I live in the United States, and I'm not in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are fighting for their survival. They will ultimately have to determine what that means. That's not up to me. They'll have to determine that. I'm hoping desperately that there's a negotiated settlement that ends this fighting quickly. I think that as long as both sides, as long as Putin believes that he actually can pull a rabbit out of the hat, as long as the Ukrainians feel that there's a possibility that they can get everything back without some sort of apocalypse, this fighting may continue. I don't know. One of the problems with what I've been hearing from some elements of the peace movement in the United States is that they want to tell the Ukrainians what the terms of the peace settlement should be. So they want to tell the Ukrainians, look, come on, folks, just give up Crimea and everything will be cool. And just, let the people in the Donbass do their thing and everything will be cool. And I think that that's very American of us. It's very American, very typical that we have the answers for the people of the world. And I would say that the Ukrainians will have to make a decision on that. And I think that for those of us supporting them, most of us at least are supporting their right to defend themselves and are not in favor of an aggressive war against Russia, that is entering into Russian territory.
Thank you. Medea, the same question for you. Is the demand that either side have an all-out victory realistic? And is it worth the human cost of war and the risk of escalating the war?
No, it's not realistic at all. First of all, it's been a lose-lose already, and it will continue to be a lose-lose as every day goes on. And this idea that we can't tell Ukrainians what to do, well, we've actually sabotaged negotiations when they have wanted them. Certainly the US has tremendous leverage when it comes to Ukraine that it could use to either sabotage negotiations or promote negotiations. And until now, it's done the former. Yes, for the previous question, Ukraine can certainly survive. There can be an arrangement in the Donbass, such as the one that was already proposed in the Minsk agreements, where there would be autonomy. And then the issue of Crimea is a huge issue. And if the US really thinks that it should help the Ukrainians in trying to take back Crimea, we are headed towards a World War III or potentially a nuclear conflict. And I don't think we should just lightly dismiss that. The Russians are not going to let go of Ukraine without a massive fight. And I want to quote a general, Erich Vlad, who was the #1 military advisor to Angela Merkel in Germany, saying about Crimea, this region is as important to the Russians and their Black Sea fleet as the Caribbean or the Panama Canal is to the United States, or the South China Sea is to China. For strategic reasons, the Russians cannot leave. If they were forced to pull out by massive Western intervention, they would certainly resort to nuclear weapons. So those of us who want to see not only Ukraine continue to survive, but the world continues to survive, should stop supporting this fueling of the war and should demand from our country that they push for negotiations now.
Thank you. Okay. I have a question from Jeff V. Since the end of World War II, the U.S. has been the preeminent invader of other countries: Korea, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Vietnam, Panama, Grenada, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. In light of this, does the U.S. have any moral authority other than might makes right to tell Russia or any other nation not to invade another country? And this question goes to Medea first.
The U.S. has no moral authority, and I think this is clear when the people around the world look at the U.S. trying to act like it is the good versus evil, and we see the global South not wanting to take sides in this war. Because they see the history of the United States. Certainly, Putin should be brought to be accountable for the crimes he's committed, but the U.S. has never tried to bring the leaders of the U.S. who invaded Iraq or invaded Libya or spent 20 years killing people in Afghanistan and now left stealing their money, bring them to account. So that's why I don't think the U.S. could possibly play any kind of positive role as a mediator in this conflict because of its history, and of course, because it is so involved in this particular conflict. We see the leaked military plans that just came out yesterday, and you see how involved the U.S. is in this war. Not only sending weapons and training, but actually deciding what targets, what strategy the Ukrainians should use. So Bill, talk about autonomy. This is not autonomy. This is the U.S. direct involvement in the war. And I think the answer is for us to recognize that there will be no peace, no solution until there is a groundswell of support from the U.S. and around the world that says that the U.S. is not a legitimate actor in this. The U.S. should stand out of the way and let other actors come in and negotiate the peace.
Thank you, Medea. And Bill, that same question to you.
Yeah, a couple of answers. So no, the U.S. has no moral authority. The U.S. is completely hypocritical. Question is whether we have any. That is, those that side with the oppressed. You know, I think that it's interesting, Medea. You keep mentioning the U.S. undermining negotiations. It's really fascinating to review what happened in the lead up to the war, and why the U.S. and others were so underprepared for the Ukrainians to resist. Everybody was estimating that Russians were going to take Kyiv within a matter of days. It would seem to me that if there had been greater preparation by the US, they would have at a minimum kept their mouths shut. So there's something strange about the argument. The other thing about the question that was raised is that it's not about whether the US has the right, it's a question about international law. For those of us that were involved in opposing the US aggression against Iraq, among other things, we made calls to the issue of international law. For those of us that have taken stands around Palestine or Western Sahara, we have made calls to international law. It's not about asking the United States government to become moral. It's about defending the issue of international law. And in the case of Ukraine, the Russians have systematically broken international law in several areas. The law against aggression, their human rights abuses, the issue of seizing land. Now we see the issue of human rights abuses in the capturing of children. I mean, there's clear issues of international law. The problem is that when you're dealing with great powers, particularly those that have nuclear weapons, it's very hard to hold them accountable because it's sort of like Clint Eastwood movie where he's holding a 44 Magnum at somebody, asking whether they feel lucky. I mean, that's part of the problem, and that goes to issues that we have to deal with. In terms of the documents that just came out, who knows what to make of them? I know in the Korean War, the Soviet Union was up to their ass in supporting the North Koreans and the Chinese. The Chinese continued to say that the troops that were in North Korea were only volunteers. That we knew that they weren't volunteers. They happened to be there for the right reason, but we knew they weren't volunteers. I mean, let's just be real and stop being naive. Of course, these forces are involved, but none of that changes the basic question. Did Russia have a right to invade Ukraine? Do the Ukrainians have the right to resist? And should they be supported? Bottom line.
Thank you, Bill. The next question is for you.
In a second, Ed, I'm sorry to interrupt. We have a limit on 100 joules. Could you look into that? Some people are not getting in because the number's staying at 100. Okay, Jules?
I haven't gotten any, maybe there is a limit on 100.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I didn't think it would be limited. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, there's a person saying they can't get in because there's a limit. So you may
Okay, I'll look and see if I can do anything. Sorry about that.
Go ahead.
This question goes to Bill. How is our involvement in the war in Ukraine impacting our lives and resources here in the U.S.?
By our, I assume that means the US government. I'm going to answer that in a different way. I think that it's less about the US involvement in Ukraine and more that we have a military budget that's off the hook, that is completely beyond the combined military budgets of other countries. We have bases all around the world. We have a level of US military involvement at a global level that is absurd. And it's the massive investment in the military by the United States that has an effect on our lives in terms of what resources go where, the distorted impact that it has on regional development, both within the United States as well as externally. And so that is what makes a real difference in our lives. And that's something that the peace movement needs to be addressing, as well as the issue of denuclearization. And the fact that the world regularly sits on edge with the possibility of nuclear exchanges. You know, whether we're talking about the French asking the US to use nuclear weapons in Indochina in 1954, whether we're talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, whether we're talking about the possibility of a nuclear exchange in 1967 during the Six-Day War, whether we're talking about Nixon threatening nuclear weapons against the Vietnamese. The world sits on that. And we've got to step back from that. That said, one thing that we have to also keep in mind is that big powers regularly use nuclear threats in order to discourage the smaller countries and the oppressed from rising up. The United States and others have repeatedly used it, and the Russians under Putin are also using it.
Thank you. Medea, the same question for you. How is our involvement in the war in Ukraine impacting our lives and resources here in the U.S.?
Well, I would agree with Bill that we put this in the context of the almost $1 trillion budget we have now that's going to the military, and what that does to skew what should be the real priorities for addressing people's needs and the climate crisis. I also think that this focus on the war and not finding a solution as quickly as possible takes the world attention away from the climate crisis. I think it hurts our pocketbooks. Particularly the over $110 billion, we now see only 48% of Americans from the latest AP poll saying they want to continue sending weapons to Ukraine. And I think this is largely because they want to see that money going for other purposes. I also think that, as Bill said, it is strengthened militarism, and we have to blame the Russians for invading Ukraine for the consequences of strengthening NATO and pushing all the countries in NATO to spend more money on militarism. It's a justification that the US Pentagon uses not only for focusing now on the war in Ukraine, but also we have the focus on China as well. And I would say, though, that it also hurts the reputation of the United States. As I said before, I think much of the world does not see the US as an honest player in this. And we see a tremendous speeding up of efforts of countries that have been subject to US sanctions, particularly, and others now to stop using the dollar, to have the exchanges in trade in large commodities like energy start being done in local currencies instead of the dollar. And I think this will speed up the downfall of the dollar as the currency for foreign exchange, and will hopefully lead the US to recognize that there is a multipolar world, and we can't try to control the entire world, that the time of US hegemony is over.
Okay, thank you. That's pretty much all the time we have for the first part of our Q&A. Medea, do you have a question for Bill? And Bill, do you have a question for Medea? And Medea, you can go first.
Well, before we end, I just want to encourage people who want to get involved in finding solutions to go to peaceinukraine.org and join that coalition, because there are efforts now to bring people together in Europe, the US, the Global South. We're all meeting in Vienna on June 10th to try to have a global call for peace that we then send out, physically take to Kyiv, to Moscow, to all the capitals of the NATO countries. And I wonder if Bill might want to join that effort.
Thank you for the question and invitation.
First, Bill, do you have a question for Medea? Oh, well, first answer her question.
I have a question,
sorry.
but I'm going to hold the question until I respond to her invitation.
Okay, great.
It depends. My presence would depend on whether calls for peace are linked to calls for the immediate withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine. And so that would be my response. My question is, we're not going to agree on the bigger issues. Medea and I both know that. We happen to like each other a lot, but we're not going to agree. So my question to you, Medea, is when do we start working together on getting the Moroccans out of Western Sahara?
Well, let's do that today after this call, because I've always been extremely supportive of that struggle and your efforts. And as Bill says, we like each other very much. He's also an incredible author. I don't like a lot of your pieces on Ukraine as much as I like the novel that you wrote, which is extraordinary. And I encourage people to read it. And I thank you, Bill, for engaging and everybody who's been engaged in this, because I think it's an example of the kind of civil discussion that we need more and more. And I thank so much MFSO for organizing it and encourage others to keep this dialogue going. But yes, Bill, I will be very happy to work with you around the Sahara issue.
Sounds good.
Okay. Final question, and I think kind of you answered this already. Then you each have 5 minutes. Where do you see common ground for us here in the peace community in regards to the best path to peace in Ukraine? And I guess I'll go with Bill first this time.
I don't think that there is common ground when it comes to Ukraine. I think that there's a very deep division. It's a division that existed in the 1930s about whether to encourage the United States to support the Spanish Republic against the fascists. I think that it's whether to support the United States in giving aid to the Chinese against the Japanese invasion in 1937. So I think that we have a very big divide, and there's no ignoring it, pretending it doesn't exist. I think that there's common ground on supporting humanitarian aid, opposing human rights abuses and atrocities, the demand for reparations. Perhaps some people would agree that Russia needs to pay reparations to Ukrainians. But in terms of the immediate question of supporting Ukraine's resistance or not, we just have a fundamental difference. And as I keep saying, it's a serious difference, but it need not be a difference that blocks us from working together on other things. Unfortunately, there are some people in the movement, including people I would argue are provocateurs, who have been absolutely and very anxiously trying to encourage a kind of internal civil war within progressive circles around this. I think that sometimes you have to just understand you're not going to agree. Don't pretend, just walk away. And we're going to do our stuff. Those of us in the Ukraine Solidarity Network are going to be doing our work to support the Ukrainians. Medea and her allies will be doing theirs. And God bless you.
Thank you. Medea, do you have a statement for that, or your response, or your answer to the question?
I think as
common ground for us.
I think as time goes by, we will see more and more common ground, because there will hopefully be more possibilities for moving this from the battlefield to the negotiating table. And as that process happens, I think the middle ground will be found. Right now, there are people calling for an end to U.S. Military support and calling for negotiations, who we might not agree with on about 95% of the other things that they deal with, like Marjorie Taylor Greene. I feel much more in solidarity with Bill Fletcher than I do with her. But let's remember, there were 30 progressive Democrats who called for negotiations back in October before they got pushed down by their own party, because when there's a Democrat in the White House, you're not supposed to question him on issues of national security. And let's also remember that Bill and I have a lot in common with the 1,500 members of the faith-based community who called for a truce, including Reverend Barber from the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend Jesse Jackson, and many others that we see eye to eye on all kinds of issues, particularly domestic issues. I think that we have a lot in common with understanding that this planet faces the existential threat of the climate crisis. And I am happy to see more and more environmentalists and environmental groups signing on to a call for a peace process in order to put our energy and our money into the climate crisis. And I also think that there is a lot in common of fearing a nuclear war, and that we have to work more closely with all of those organizations that have been pushing, some successfully, for arms deals, including ones that the US pulled out of in Russia during Bush's time, during Trump's time, and to try to rebuild, as we move towards peace in Ukraine, rebuild those arms treaties. And I would think that Bill and I also just have a lot of desire that the world signs on to the UN treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, so that we can have a world free of nuclear weapons and move towards a world that not only solves this conflict, but a world that ends war.
Thank you, Medea and Bill. And thank you.
And
to
we
the
have a
chat-
couple more questions to ask, number 9 on the list. And Jules might have a few to ask. Thanks.
Okay. Well, we do have more time, and I was told to stop the questions at 11, and it was 10:54.
11:20.
So, okay. This question goes to Medea, or to Bill first. Oh, no, Medea first. Martin, from Martin M. How can we support the growth of the peace movement in Ukraine and Russia?
Well, I'm sorry, I thought we were ending right then, so that was more of my plea. In terms of supporting the peace movement in Ukraine and Russia, many people from those countries are going to join us in Vienna when we meet on June 10th. And certainly part of our efforts there are to support the peace movements inside of those countries. There's also networks globally that have been set up to support the Russians who have fled the country because they don't want to fight. There are also Ukrainians that are part of a conscientious objector movement. And so there are some very wonderful networks that help these people to reside in other countries, get jobs, continue their work in trying to build more networks within both Ukraine and Russia, calling for an end to this war.
Okay, and Bill, same question for you. And this one is, how can we support the growth of peace movement in Ukraine and Russia?
Before I do, how long are we going?
Well, we are
I'm a little
scheduled
confused.
till 11:30, so we still have time.
Okay, I see. There are, there are organizations in Ukraine that are looking for our support. And unfortunately, I'm drawing a blank right now. If you go to the site of Ukraine Solidarity Network, contact us through that, and we can get back to you on that. That's all I can answer right now. Sorry.
Okay, that's okay. I'd just like to thank the organizers and Medea and Bill and the audience for participating. The organizers really worked hard on making this event possible. And we challenge every one of you who works for peace to use this forum as a springboard for organizing your own forum, and in that way strengthen our powerful peace community. Look for the recording of this on Veterans for Peace YouTube channel. And if you have comments, I'm on YouTube. You can this will be on YouTube, so there will be comments allowed underneath the video. And if you want to make comments, we encourage you to make comments to whoever you want, or just your own comments about what you think about this. And we would like to, like we said, hear plans of others who want to continue this forum. I think we learned quite a bit of the similarities and the differences in the different and some people, and two people who are leaders in the nation on peace. And we are hoping to encourage that through the community and through others. And we've noticed in the past that there are differences in the peace movement, and sometimes there's even anger at the other faction. And we want to impress upon the fact that we are for peace, and peace means nonviolence. And if we have violence towards other people in the peace community, we're really working against each other for that. So we encourage you to continue the peace movement and see if you can do some more forums. Thank you from the committee. The committee's on the top two rows. Ms. Doreen Marshall, myself, Pat Alviso was the leader, Mary Latke. And so thank you very much with Felicity Figueroa and Kathleen Hernandez. They were all part of this. Thank you very much.
Thank y'all so much. Does our organizers want to stick around for a few minutes and talk, or do we want to do that else another time, Pat? You muted, Pat.
Do we have any more questions that we should be spending for the next 15 minutes if our speakers have questions?
I have a couple of audience questions. I thought we had wanted to end on that. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah,
It's up to you.
I know that we cut short the Q&A. So maybe we could offer those people that submitted questions on the chat an opportunity to at least get them read by our speakers. And if they choose to reply, that could be great, but yeah.
Okay, so I will give you a couple more questions from the chat. The first one is going to be, this one's from Catherine Murphy. Is there evidence that the U.S. is sabotaging negotiations?
And who would you like that to go to?
It was, let's go Medea first.
Well, yes, there's a lot of evidence. We go back to the talks that were happening in March, where Boris Johnson from the UK came in after the talks were moving along very well and said that the West didn't want him to make an agreement, that the West would be there for Ukraine to fight it out with Russia instead. And then Austin came in and said we had to use this opportunity to weaken Russia. And then we saw that Naftali Bennett from who is the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, said more recently that he too had been engaged in negotiations. There was an effort on both sides to reach a ceasefire, and that the West blocked that. And now we see most recently with the Chinese proposal. You know, I was in a hearing when Anthony Blinken was testifying just about 2 weeks ago now, and was arrested for getting up and saying, if you don't like the Chinese peace proposal, where is your own? And the fact that the US has never put forward a peace proposal, but has only sabotaged the other efforts at peace, I think is a good indication that the US is happy to keep this war going with the Ukrainians losing their lives as a way to, quote, weaken Russia and not have Russia be a strong ally if the US goes into war with China.
I've never seen any evidence about the US blocking negotiations. I keep hearing about Boris Johnson. Yes, Boris Johnson did what he did. What's more important for us to understand is, what are the Ukrainian people doing and saying? You know, it's if we were looking at a situation in Ukraine where half the population or less was in favor of continuing the war of resistance, you know, maybe. We're not looking at anything like that. We're looking at overwhelming numbers of Ukrainians that are saying we have to keep fighting, and in fact, keep fighting to get the land back. It's their land, folks. It's their land that was taken from them. I mean, when are we going to get that into our heads? It was their land, right? It wasn't up for negotiation. The Russians recognized their land twice and then chose 2014 to muck around. I mean, let's be real about it. So do we, I mean, and the other part is that it's the Russians and the Ukrainians that have to come to a settlement themselves. Do we want, we obviously do not want the US to sabotage this, but we want the Ukrainians, it seems to me, we would want the Ukrainians to be in a very strong position in going into any negotiations.
Okay. You had another question?
I sure did. Andy Berman asked, do you think internal conflicts in Russia from the resistance, from the Russian military, from the Wagner group, do you think they present the possibility that Putin will be pushed aside in favor of new leadership with serious interest in ending the war?
Bill, you can take that first.
Oh, I think it's a crapshoot. I think that that there's clearly internal challenges, and they, you know, this is way before the war started. You know, issues around democracy, the growing semi-fascist nature of the Putin regime, and what that's meant in terms of resistance, et cetera. So you have all of those factors. You have the deployment of former prisoners on the front lines, you know, in sort of human wave assault type motion. So you have things like that, that's creating a lot of discontent. But the removal of Putin could go any way. I mean, Putin could be removed and be replaced by someone further to his right. So there's no guarantee that the removal of Putin would bring about a just peace settlement. You know, we could dream, but it's not. It's not obvious in terms of how things would end up.
Okay, thank you.
Did
there
you want me to
anything else?
answer that as well?
If you want, oh yes, thank you.
Well, I agree with Bill. Be careful what you wish for, but also I think that we can hope that internal pressure within Russia, be it the sanctions starting to kick in. You know, the US thought that the sanctions against Russia would immediately have an effect of tanking the ruble, and that hasn't happened, but the effect of the sanctions will start to impact the standard of living of the Russian people soon enough, and that will create more discontent in Russia. There are also many millions of Russians who are seeking alternative sources of information, not just the government propaganda. And there are, unfortunately, now thousands and thousands of families who have lost their sons in this fight. And just like in the past, they could form a strong group pushing for an end to this war. So I am hoping that there is pressure within Russia to bring this to a close, and that pressure, it becomes more and more felt by Putin in looking for an off-ramp, as President Biden has said he needs.
Okay, well, thank you very much. If there are no more questions, I think that we have finished our event, and I once again thank you all for attending and for being here, and especially for our guests, Medea Benjamin and Bill Fletcher, who have given us a lot of information that we need to chew on and discuss amongst ourselves and come up with other things if we can. We are all for peace, and that's the main thing. So peace for all. Thank you very much.